Okay, great. Thank you so much, Susan. So what are you going to get out of this? So tools for risk response planning, facility with risk response planning, and appreciation for the value of effective risk response planning, and hopefully a new relationship with risk as an opportunity. So, you know, a lot of organizations identify risk, they create a risk register, they hand it over to somebody and they're like, okay, we did risk management. What happens if you do that, particularly with your threat risk, if you identify your threat risk, but you actually don't do anything about them, they tend to just become issues. So I'm going to talk to you about what are those other things that we need to do after I identify risks. So fundamentally, we want to reduce probability and or impact of our threat risk, and we want to increase the probability and or impact of our opportunity risk. So these are things we don't often think about. So I'm going to start with a video that I'm going to share with you. And I'm going to go ahead and play this. So the question is, what is risk? So I'm going to watch the video and we'll talk about it. That's fine. So yes, I did crash. This is in the Outer Banks. I was taking an advanced hang gliding lesson, going for my hang gliding certification. And so the funny thing about it, the reason I'm kind of smiling, even though I do kind of squint a little bit when I see my crash. The great thing about that is my cohort there, who is in a training camp with me, that said, "Thank goodness for helmets." So so what I say is, thank goodness for risk management. I will tell you that when my head hit the keel of the inside of the hang glider, it's called the keel, like similar to like on a boat, a keel. When it hit that, even with the helmet on, I was like, ooh, I kind of felt that. So that to me is what risk management's about. It's about being prepared for things. And there's actually a lot of things we do in hang gliding to be prepared. There's a lot of safety, fault protection, things like that. So anyway, so there's our reason. So what does risk look like? So, you know, what do we do to manage risk? So I'm going to talk to you about some of those things from the hang gliding perspective. Helmet, definitely always wear a helmet. There's safety checks. So we actually check out the hang glider. There's just pipes and tubing, and where the actual hang gliding material, which actually it's the same material that's used for like sails, for sailing. So it's a similar type of really heavy kind of, I guess, canvas. We have backups. So there's actually how you attach yourself to the hang glider. There's like a strap, and there's a backup strap in case that one breaks, and you have a carabiner that you use to attach. There's actually breakaways, so that the frame of the hang glider is like a triangle. I have a hang glider over there, but I don't think it'll show on video very well. So it's kind of like a triangle. Well, it'll actually break if you hit. It'll bend the pipe if it's a hard enough hit, and that actually is a good thing. You can then go and replace that part. If that happens. I actually did not bend the frame, but I'm not like a real heavy person. If I was a heavier person, I might have, if I was a larger man or something like that. The guys I was hang gliding with, maybe some of them were twice my weight. So when they crashed, they did break that. Flight check. So we always do like a flight check before we go. So we look at the area, we look at what's down below, we look at things to the side of us to see if there's anything in the way, anybody in the way. We also do a wind check, see what direction the wind's coming from. You always want to fly into the wind. So anybody who knows anything about aviation, a lot more stable to fly into the wind. Also, if you fly into the wind, you don't have to run as hard to get the right speed to get yourself to lift off. So that's a little tip there. We also do some calls and communication. So we'll say, like when somebody hands you the hang glider, it's a windy place there in the Outer Banks. So if somebody hands you a hang glider and you don't have it totally gripped, it could just fly away without you. So that's not good. So you want to be like, got it, got it. Okay, do you have it? I got it. Yes. So, you know, those types of calls and communication. We also do a call out before we take off in flight. And of course, a certification. I am actually still not certified. I'm probably a class away from being certified, but then I kind of stopped going to do that and got involved in other things. But I'm, you know, I'm able to fly solo, okay, but I got to do it when instructors around. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen again to this is more for edification to share what it looks like when it does go well. Okay. So I think this is the good one. There's actually not much audio. It's just the sound of wind, so you're not missing the audio anyway. This is just to make me feel better, so you can see what it was supposed to look like. Oh, that's much better. There we go. So a little entertainment, today. Not a little different than most of my. I usually don't come with video, but that just makes me feel better that she saw that I actually could do it. I just got a video of me crashing. But I said, this is great. I do risk management. I will tell you this, if I was not wearing a helmet, I would have been in the hospital. I'm pretty darn sure. So it's nice to know that you have a helmet. I wear a helmet when I bike on the road. I wear a helmet if I'm on a motorcycle. So yes, helmets are good, even in a race car. I've done a lot of extreme sports, I guess. So let me continue on with the textbook part of things. So defining risk. So whenever I start a project, I always start here with defining risk. The reason for that is you would be surprised how many people have not a solid understanding of risk or don't have the education on it. So I always like to start by defining risk. Oftentimes people think risks are only threat risks. A risk is actually just an uncertain event or condition. And if this event or condition occurs, has a positive or negative effect on at least one project objective. A few things to note about that. So if you define a risk, but the impact is not on one of your project objectives, you may have defined a risk for a program, portfolio, or an enterprise risk for your organization. So keep that in mind, that project risks affect your project objectives, at least one of them. Okay, so risk is broken up into two parts, the probability and the impact. Probability is the likelihood that the event will occur. The impact is the consequences of that risk occurring. It's very important to use both of these. I like to use the format of an if-then statement. So if I get a flat tire when I'm driving into work, then I may be late for my meeting. Okay, and then I can deal with that. The identification of risk is really important for the management of risk, because if we haven't done a good job identifying the risk, it's going to be difficult to reduce the threat risk or increase the opportunity risk. So what is the difference in a risk and an issue? One of my pet peeves is when people say risk/issues, or they put risks and issues together in the same table or the same chart. I can't stand that, because a risk is an event that may occur in the future. A problem or an issue is actually a threat risk that has occurred, and we're dealing with it right now. So people often say, I'm going to resolve that risk. You can't resolve a risk because it's uncertainty. You can resolve an issue. What I usually relate this to is spilled milk. So if I've got a glass of milk sitting on the edge of the table, is the risk of the glass falling over and the milk spilling out. Okay, so how I deal with that is very different than if the glass knocks over and the milk is on the floor. Now I have a different thing to deal with. How will I manage that spilled milk on the floor? I'm going to clean it up. Maybe I'm going to get some sort of like carpet cleaner type thing. What I'm going to do is going to be very different than the glass on the table. Well, maybe I'll move it farther into the table. Maybe I'll put a lid on it. Maybe I'll just remove it entirely from the table if I have like a laptop or something else there. So there's many different ways of dealing with the risk. They're all very, very different than how we deal with the issue. So I always like to think of the glass of spilled milk. So fundamentally, if you haven't identified your risks, you're already taking them. I know one of my dentists had in the office a sign on the wall that said, "You only need to floss the teeth you want to keep." Okay, so I've always thought about this in regards to risk management. You only need to identify the risks you want to manage. If you don't identify a risk, then you're not going to manage it. Okay, so let's talk about why we want to manage risks. So we talk about risks a little bit, but why do we really want to manage them? Well, if we look at the project constraints of scope, cost, and time, this is called the triple constraint. And what the triple constraint says that if one of these changes, scope, cost, or time, then one of the other ones must change. So when somebody says, hey, I'm going to increase the scope on your project by 20%, you say, okay, great. So are you going to give me more money or are you going to give me more time or both? Right? So unfortunately, our customers don't like to hear that, but I call this gravity for project management. So there's no way around that. If I increase the scope and I don't change the cost or the time, what will be affected is going to be the quality, right? So we want to keep that in mind. So trying to get my writing tool. Okay, it's not going to work. No worries. If I had oh, here we go. I think I got it now. Okay, yeah. So the way I would like to show this is risk is like this cloud around time, cost, and scope. Okay, so when we think about risk, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at the uncertainty associated with scope, cost, and time. If there wasn't uncertainty with these, then we could just plan a project as a project manager and walk away. Come back for beer and pizza at the end of the project when everything goes well, because we planned a good project, right? And that's all that's to it. So we know there's more to it than that. All right, so we want to manage risk because we want to identify potential problems. We also want to identify opportunities. So opportunities result in benefits. So don't forget about that. That's another thing to consider. We also want to efficiently manage our project resources. We want to reduce threats, which are, again, potential problems. Risk management allows us to do a structured and systematic review of our project to look at all the things that could potentially go wrong and all the things that could potentially go right. And that's really what identifying risks is all about. And then we want to do some decision making. So we can use risk management to make decisions. We can use expected monetary value and other tools to be able to make decisions. We have all this uncertainty. If we can quantify the uncertainty, we can use that to make decisions. Also, risk management is a process for system improvements, and it's also a great vehicle for communication for a project, particularly to key stakeholders and upper management. So when do we want to manage risk? Well, we want to do it throughout the project. And in order to do that, we want to develop a risk management plan. Our risk management plan should define risk, as I did just in the beginning here. It should also define the project's risk tolerance. That's not my own risk tolerance. but the risk tolerance for the project. So probably comes from the project sponsor or the organization and what their tolerance is for this particular project. You can think of risk tolerance in the way that if you have it like an investment and you talk to an investment counselor, they'll ask you, what's your risk tolerance? Are you risk seeking? Are you risk averse? Are you risk neutral? I know for myself, I'm a little bit risk averse. So how I invest my money has always been a little bit more on the risk averse side. Although for my long-term retirement, I tend to be a little bit more risk seeking, but on the low side of risk seeking, just because I realize that that's the best way in the long run for retirement funds. So anyway, so that's what risk tolerance. You can have this. You have the same thing for the project, and that should be defining your risk management plan. You also want to detail your risk policy, which says why you're managing risk and what the purpose of that is for your organization, or which eventually your project is supporting. You also want to establish the risk management process. I tend to use the process that PMI has put together in the PMBOK guide. You also want to define roles, particularly these are roles related to risk management. Your roles for your entire project are more defined in your human resource management plan. You also want to plan your process implementation. So how are you actually going to do risk management? So are you going to have meetings? Which stakeholders are going to be involved? You can baseline your risk, but what you don't want to do is have your risk register as part of your risk management plan. Your risk management plan should focus on how risk management is done for your project. So what are the processes and what are the tools and techniques that you're going to use for your project to manage risk? And then you also want to develop risk documentation and templates, which may include like a risk register format that you're going to use, a risk identification form, or other risk reporting tools. Okay, so if we break it down, I kind of like this. This is like sort of the 5 things. It's a little bit abbreviated to what PMI does with theirs. And hang on a second. Show you on the screen here. So if you can see my video, the back of my business card, oh, it's hard to see if I get closer with the blurred background, but the back of my business card has this process on it. One of my colleagues years ago told me that she was using people's business cards to even out her furniture. And I said to myself, what can I put on the back of my business card that will make it more valuable for people so they won't use it to raise a leg of their furniture? So I thought I'd provide something of value. So those are on the back of my business cards, which I tend to not hand out anymore. I tend to just connect with people on LinkedIn. So these are the processes of risk management. We identify. First, we identify risks. That's the key part. We then assess them. We then plan responses, which we're gonna focus on here, and then we execute, and all the time. So this is kind of a cycle. So while we're doing all that, we're also planning, monitoring, documenting, and communicating. Okay. So how do we manage risk? We use tools and techniques. So we have risk response strategies, both for threat risks and opportunity risks. We also have contingency response strategies, which we use only for threat risk. And we use expert judgment. So these are just a few of the tools that we use. Our outputs for managing risk are our risk register. We update our risk register with what we're doing as we manage those risks, as we handle the risks throughout the project. We also have contract decisions. These could be outputs of risk management, and project management plan updates. Note that the risk management plan is a subsidiary document to the project management plan. And so with that, when we update the risk management plan, it is actually updating the project management plan. But we may also have, as a result of managing risks, updates to our project management plan in the areas of the cost baseline, the scope baseline, or the schedule baseline. We can also have project document updates, so other project documents. So here's what risk response strategies for threats look like. The next slide, I'll talk about opportunities. So we can mitigate our risks. This is the one that everybody kind of gravitates to. In fact, people will often say they'll identify their risks, they'll do an assessment, like a qualitative assessment, and then they'll say they'll mitigate the risk. But that's actually kind of limiting. Really what the next step should be is planning risk response, planning your risk response, or selecting risk response strategies, which includes mitigate, avoid, transfer, or accept. And actually there's a fifth one that you could do, which is escalate. You would escalate a risk if you don't have the authority or resources to manage the risk at that level, at the project level. So that is something to also keep in mind. All right, so mitigate, everybody's familiar with mitigate, but fundamentally what mitigate does is it will either reduce the probability or the impact of a risk. So one of the things that we do, my example, the risk of driving to work and the risk of getting a flat tire, I would drive with a spare. So if I have a spare tire and I get a flat tire, I can fix a tire on the car and still make it to work. I may need to do some other things, like maybe leave for work earlier, because if I get a flat tire, it's probably going to take a few minutes to replace the spare, replace the tire that's busted with the spare or the flat tire. But just know that mitigate can either reduce the probability or the impact of a risk. So a spare tire would reduce the impact of a flat tire when driving to work. It would not reduce the probability. Things that you can do to reduce the probability of a flat tire is you can check your tires to make sure that there's enough tread on them. You can check your driveway to make sure there's no nails or other sharp objects in them. You can be careful when you're driving to work to not hit any potholes, because that would create a flat also. So those things are more around the probability of getting a flat tire and less about the impact. The spare tire is for the impact. It's to deal with what you would do if you actually did get the flat tire. All right, and then we have avoiding a risk. Well, avoiding, you're actually eliminating that risk entirely. So if you avoid a risk, that is the one thing that will remove it from your risk register. So an example of that is if I take mass transit to get to work instead of driving, I completely avoid the risk of getting a flat tire. It's no longer a risk. However, there could be a secondary risk that shows up there, and the secondary risk would be a risk around missing the train. So I have a general rule of thumb. I figure out what time I need to be somewhere. Let's say I need to be somewhere at 9. I figure out what's the train that will get me there at 9, and then I take the train before. That way, if I'm late, I'm still going to make the second train, which will get me there by 9. So that's my own mitigation for whenever I do mass transit. So just know that as you're doing risk response planning, your plans for risk responses may reduce your risk or could actually eliminate your risk. And avoid is one of those things that eliminates the risk. Transfer redistributes your risk to another area, usually another entity. So for example, insurance. You can also use a subcontract as another way to transfer your risk. And this one's interesting. I do a lot of federal government contract work. It's really not insurable. The insurance companies will not insure the federal government for their projects in general. But there are things that we can do. We can use different subcontract agreements to transfer risk. So for example, resource issues, actually the government, by hiring contractors, is transferring the risk of being able to get that work done. Because if they have a subcontractor do it and somebody leaves from that subcontract, they can probably hire a lot quicker than the federal government can, because they have to go through this detailed process to hire new staff. And then lastly is accept. So believe it or not, accept is a risk response strategy. Most people don't think of it this way. They don't realize that that is actually a strategy. There's a lyrics by Geddy Lee for any of the Rush fans out there. He says, if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. And I appreciate that from a risk management perspective, because oftentimes we accept risks, but we don't do so intentionally. And so if there's one thing I'm very interested in the arena of risk management, it's being intentional about accepting risk. And so having this as a risk response strategy means that every risk in my risk register, I need to select a strategy for. And for the low risks, it's probably going to be accept, and that's totally fine. I would much rather see that than what people often do, which is don't put the risk on the risk register. And if you don't put the risk on the risk register, guess what? You're accepting it without actually intentionally accepting it. And you also are not able to monitor it. So if that risk was low, but something happens environmentally, something changes, that risk can become high, and you wouldn't know it because you're not tracking it, you're not looking at it. So it really is a best practice to accept low risks, not to just remove them from the risk register. So here's what my risk response strategies look like for opportunity risks. I've got enhance. So with the enhance strategy, these are actions, and it says here pre-event actions. All of risk response strategies are done before the risk event occurs. So we're actually doing the planning and the execution of that plan before the risk occurs. A plan that we plan ahead of time and enact later would be like a fallback plan or even a contingency plan. Might be something you enact after the risk happens. Usually a contingency plan, you want to enact it right before the risk happens if you know it's going to happen. So for example, a shelter in place or a hurricane would be a contingency plan. Evacuate would be a contingency plan if you know a hurricane's coming. So there's several of those. A fallback plan might be to go to a shelter if you couldn't get out of town quick enough. So our opportunity risk response strategies, we can enhance our risk, which is kind of like the opposite of mitigate. We actually want to increase the probability of it happening and increase the impact of that risk event. So these are opportunity risks, which means they generate benefits for the project. So by enhancing them, we're going to increase probability or impact of that. I'll give you an example. A lot of consulting contract types of projects, if you finish early, there could be a bonus associated with that. So if I know we're ahead of schedule, I might want to hire additional staff to increase my probability of completing the project early. And then we'll get a bonus with that, which will more than pay for the person I add on. So that might be a good strategy to use for that opportunity risk. Another risk response strategy is to exploit. So this drives the risk event to occur. My example of this is one of the companies that I used to do training for had me do training at a organization site. They had a training room that they pretty much didn't use, maybe 80–90% of the time. And so the colleague of mine had an agreement with them where we did training in their facility. And in that, as part of that bartering for that, they would actually have 1 to 2 people that would attend for free. And so the company that was providing the training facility that we were using was actually exploiting that resource that they had that they weren't using. So this is actually driving a benefit, and the benefit they had was basically free training for a few people on their staff. So it was quite wise. Next, sharing the risk opportunity. This is sort of the opposite side of transfer. So when we share a risk opportunity, we're actually sharing it with another individual or group. So this often looks like a subcontract. So the example I often use, if anyone's ever been to the Cherry Blossom Festival in DC, that's probably around the corner sometime soon. It's in March, April timeframe. It's gorgeous. If you've never been there, I highly recommend. It's hard to time. You don't always know when the cherry blossoms are going to open, but if you search it on Google, they'll give you a guesstimate of when they think they're going to open. So let's say I'm a t-shirt vendor and I got real lucky this year that the Cherry Blossom Festival was actually on the weekend where the blossoms were the most open. So this does not always happen because you can't predict this event. But they plan for the Cherry Blossom Festival. It's a weekend-long festival. They plan for it at least a year in advance. So I'm a t-shirt vendor and I got lucky, and there's tons of people out in DC on the mall there in that area, like looking at the cherry blossoms and all that. And I'm doing so well that I sold out of t-shirts. Well, one of the things that I might have put in place beforehand is just in case I'm doing really well and I sell out of t-shirts, I have another vendor who can make t-shirts. So I can make them at night, in between, Saturday and Sunday, things like that. I can make some t-shirts at night, but there's only so much I can make at night. So what I've set up in advance is to share the risk of me selling out by having an agreement with a subcontractor so that they will actually make these t-shirts also. Now, it costs me more to buy the t-shirts from them that they've made than using my own t-shirts. However, if I don't do that, then I'm just going to sell out and I lose this opportunity for making more money. Okay, so that's what share looks like. You'll see computers, laptops do this, so they'll have like AMC or Intel processors on the same laptop. And one of the reasons they do that is because in case Intel can't get them chips or AMC can't get them chips, they have the other company they can go to. But everything else is the same about the laptop. Most of my laptops have the Intel processor, but I have seen my exact same laptop with an AMC processor. And then lastly, accept. It just means we take no other action, and because it is a opportunity risk, we're hoping it happens. So, but we're not going to do anything more. We're just hoping for it. Okay, so risk planning, monitoring, documentation, and communication. Here we monitor, track, and communicate risk. We track the progress of mitigating the risk or transferring the risk or avoiding the risk. Avoiding the risk, it should just remove from the risk register, so we probably don't need to track that. But this is where we track all that. We communicate this information to management and to internal and external stakeholders as necessary. How frequently we communicate and what we communicate is all detailed in our risk management plan. And this is the integration of risk management with cost and schedule processes. So we want to make sure that whatever we determine that we want to do, these risk strategies, we want to make sure that those correctly, properly update the cost baseline, the schedule baseline for the project. We really want to have collaboration on risk management at all levels with different stakeholders. And we want to provide leadership support of risk management at all levels. And we also want to provide timely and meaningful information to decision makers. So that brings us to our summary. Risk management is an organized, systematic decision-making process that efficiently plans, assesses, handles, monitors, and documents risk in order to increase the likelihood of achieving project goals and decrease the likelihood that a risk will become a future problem. We want to consider all possible risk response strategies. Don't just quickly go to mitigate. We also want to intentionally accept risk when appropriate. We want to document, reassess, and monitor risks throughout the project. And fundamentally, we want to create a culture of risk awareness. One of the things to keep in mind is that risk awareness starts with me. So I am that person that is always reminding people, let's think about risk. Let's be proactive. Let's think about the things that could go wrong and plan for them. And I'll leave you with a quote here. Everyone wants to be doing, it's about risk management. So everyone wants to be doing it. Everyone thinks everybody else is doing it. Not many people are actually doing it, and no one's doing it particularly well. So hopefully you can appreciate that and take a chuckle. Here's where you can find me on LinkedIn. I realize it's difficult to click on those links in this format, but you can just email me. My email address is at the bottom here, and it'll be on some other slides here too. If you email me and you're on LinkedIn, I can just invite you to the group, or you can connect with me on LinkedIn and I can invite you to these groups. So one is on risk management implementation. The other is on agile risk management, which is a topic people don't talk about so much. This is just a little sample risk register. If you want these slides, please email me and I will send you a PDF so you can have them. And these are a few slides at the end here. I'm not going to go through them, but they're about the RMP certification. And then I'll just highlight real quickly, I am teaching a class in April and one in October. It's an evening class online. It's 12 hours, but you'll actually earn all of the PDUs that you need for your risk management certification, because there's online material too. So if you're interested in that, please give me a shout out. And again, all of that certification information will be provided to you if you shoot me an email. I'll send you the PDF for that. So now's the time for questions. Do we have any good questions, Susan?
We do, yes. Thank you, Susan. Great presentation as always. Thank you. You did just touch on this, but I will say the question we have is, do you have a favorite template for a risk register? Is there a location or website that is your go-to for the most current and up-to-date templates for risk management?
Well, I used to have a website, but I wasn't very good at managing it and keeping it up to date. I do have a template that I use for my projects. That slide was in there to kind of give you a feel for that. The one I use for my contracting consulting work is a little fancier. So yeah, you can look at that one. There's a book, other than my own book that I shared. One is Polaris Lessons in Risk Management. This is by a gentleman, John Byrne. He's a professor, teaches in Pennsylvania. I think it's Penn State, but I'm not entirely sure. And then my friend and colleague, Carl Pritchard, wrote this book, Risk Management Concepts and Guidance. I actually have a signature from him on it. Thanks for taking the risk. I attended one of his presentations many years ago, and I since then actually was a keynote speaker with him. Yeah, it was back in 2011, 11 years ago. It's a long time ago. But he's a very very good for risk management information. The nice thing about risk management concepts and guidance is it gives you lots of tools and techniques. It's almost like an encyclopedia of tools and techniques for risk identification, etc. So I needed my glasses to see over my bookshelf, see where my books were. I don't need them for this though. So great question. And you can also shoot me an email if you have other questions like that. I don't particularly have a website, but I would say when you do look at things, make sure you're using a project management related or a collegiate type of website. I don't like when people use things like Investopedia or Wikipedia because they're really not validated by subject matter experts, which is why I think you asked the question, but there's no specific website that I have in mind. Other questions, Susan?
Yes, thank you for answering that one. Thank you. Our next question is, can you provide an example of risk tolerance from a project management perspective?
Oh, sure. So there's something called a probability and impact matrix, and your probability and impact matrix, it has like red. Oh, that was weird. My screen did something odd. It has like red, yellow and green. So some people call it like a heat map. When you're looking at probability and impact matrix, the more red that you see, the lower the risk tolerance is. So it means that more of your risks will be considered high for your project. The less red that you see on a probability and impact matrix chart, it means your tolerance is higher for risk. So you're willing to accept more risk for the project. So that's one of the ways that you see it. And as far as examples, okay, so NASA projects, they're sending people into space, have a much lower tolerance for risk because people's lives are at risk. The same thing in the military. Whereas a project like maybe like I'm trying to think of federal projects that would have a lower risk tolerance. I want to say things at Census Bureau, but they're very cognizant of customer view. So there's definitely a lot of risk associated. They're asking for a lot of data, so they want to make sure people are comfortable providing data and not concerned about their data getting out there. So they have a low risk tolerance for that. So I think it depends upon the project. If you can think about maybe around your home, risk tolerance for a project where you're painting versus putting tile or flooring in, your risk tolerance might be different for those types of projects. The painting, you're probably deal with a little bit of error, but maybe floor tile, you wouldn't. So hopefully that helps.
Great. Thank you, Susan. We do have another question. How do you carry out effective risk identification? My organization is not keen to sit and discuss risk.
Yeah, so I know that very well. I actually interviewed a bunch of colleagues of mine when I was working on a book that I'm writing by myself. And I talked to them about risk management. And I said, what do you think about, like, there's just a lot of different questions I had. And one of my colleagues said, it's like a bad 4-letter word, and we should really just change that word or remove the word because people hear the word risk. Like if you say, hey, we're going to talk about risk, you're not going to get this like great turnout for the meeting. So sometimes like it's the way you position it. Say, okay, we're going to talk about this project and all the possibilities of things that could go well or possibilities of things that might not go well, and we're going to talk about that. Or you can call it a project planning meeting and then start talking about risk. So sometimes be careful with the title for your meeting because a lot of times people are hesitant to talk about risk because they think of it in a negative light. So that's one thing. Make it fun, and the biggest thing is your attitude about it. So when my team members come to me and say, "Hey, I noticed a risk," I'm like, "Great! I'm happy. I'm smiling about it," which seems kind of funny, but if I have a sort of glum reaction to like, oh, another risk, then they're not going to want to come to me. So we want to keep that in mind. What's our attitude about people bringing risks to us? I'd rather somebody bring 10 risks than one problem because a risk is something I can do something about. How do you identify risks? Like what tools and techniques can you use? There are many of them out there. You can look at the practice standard for project risk management, which is a free publication through PMI. And in the appendix, it'll give you many different ways to identify risks. The Carl Pritchard book, Risk Management Concepts and Guidance, gives you a number of ways to manage or to identify risks. You can also do a Google search, identifying project risks, and come up with some different ways. Brainstorming is probably one of the hardest but most commonly known. There are some nuances to brainstorming. I like the method where you write, have everybody write like 1 to 3 risks on sticky notes and you collect them and then you assimilate them in the front of the room. You kind of group them all together. You read them out to people and then you do another set of that. You'll generate a lot of risks, and by doing it on sticky notes, it becomes anonymous. People are more comfortable with that. Oftentimes, people don't want to jump out and write down a risk. They're maybe not comfortable with doing that. So there's some ideas
Great. Well, thank you, Susan. Our next question is there a unit of measurement for risk tolerance other than a heat map or like HML, I guess high, medium, low?
Generally that's how I see it is high, medium, low, but you could get into more granularity like very low, low, medium, high, very high. But generally speaking, it's risk tolerance is in a qualitative way. You could have a quantitative equivalent for that. So if you're doing quantitative risk analysis on your project, which is not required, but some projects do have it, you would then have numbers associated with that. So a risk that has a cost impact that's greater than 10% would be considered, a high risk with that impact or higher than the tolerance for risk for the project. So you could have some quantitative numbers, but it would be project specific. And there'd usually be one around cost, one around scope, and one around schedule. So like, for example, a schedule deviation of more than 2 days may be above your risk tolerance. For some projects, maybe a schedule deviation of 1 day would be a problem. So you could do it in both kinds of ways. Great questions.
Thank you so much, Susan, for presenting with us today. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Susan. Have a great day, everybody, and please feel free to reach out to me.